Got you. Some might have the little red or the red and green light. Tells you I didn't have much of a rap career. I can't tell. We all start off as rappers in the black community. So I was just saying I was looking at, for those who are joining us online, and I was looking at Charles Payne's beautiful narration of the Greenwood movement in chapter 5 of I've Got the Light of Freedom, because in some ways that is the pivotal SNCC program or SNCC campaign or SNCC. It's hard to say what it was. This moving on in Mississippi is the way that SNCC elders talk about it. How do you move on into a place? And Greenwood was where they really were able to establish one of the most critical bases of the movement during this era. And the way that Payne narrates it, of course, he starts with people who are already there, right? He doesn't talk about the people who are so-called outsiders. And so this ability of people like a Richard West, an elder who, like we talked about yesterday, that generation coming from, coming of age, if you will, in the post-Second World War II era. But what I also like about Richard West, he was Negro Leagues, he played for the Memphis Negro Leagues team, and decided to settle in Greenwood. It's like, again, this notion of a migration out sometimes dominates the narrative, but some people wanted to come back into Mississippi, right? And so what are they coming back into? And then what is SNCC coming into as they look to Greenwood as a base? And so I was just looking at that as we all were settling in. Dr. Allegra, who will start with Sunflower and LaFleur County, which is those two counties, adjacent counties in the Delta, and Sam Block and Fannie Lou Hamer, is probably going to deal with the bulk of the Greenwood movement. But I have to say, understanding how connected all of this stuff is, that, we really can't conceive of a Freedom Summer without understanding Greenwood and how Greenwood sets the stage as a base. And every movement has these moments where momentum begins to not only shift, but stabilizes to such a degree that we feel that we've established something, that we've got something, built, right? And for SNCC, it was Greenwood, right? And so every SNCC person seems to have a relationship to, or a connection to, happenings in this part of the state, the Delta, which is such a hugely important economic region for plantation labor primarily. But it was also the base for so much of their coming into the work of the movement, as Mississippi became clear that we're going to have a Mississippi wing of the struggle, right? And so it's also important to say, of course, that SNCC was not just one state. SNCC had connections all across the South, and we are in mourning today. Bernice Johnson Reagan made her transition Monday, July 16th, and I want to raise her name for several reasons. Really, I could talk about her for the next hour, but I won't do that. We'll figure out a way to do that, though. But she was, at the same time, they were struggling in Greenwood and Macomb. They were struggling in Southwest Georgia. Is it Southwest? Getting my geography skills. Albany, Georgia, where she was a student at an HBCU, Albany State, and she ends up getting involved in the movement and kicked out of Albany State. She was, of course, the figure who really best exemplifies the idea that we can sing toward our liberation, or we can use sound to imagine and build towards our liberation. Her beautiful voice, her beautiful alto voice, and her ability to make the songs that were dominant in the Afro-Christian spiritual tradition be relevant to the freedom struggle, not just to the change of lyrics, but to the transposition of the spiritual message in the moment when you needed it the most, when you thought that you were actually about to catch the L, right? this is the thing that we went to. We went to the sound. We went back to the sound, right? And it was the sound that buoys them as they are in prison, in jail. It is the sound that buoys them as they are waiting to, board these buses and get on these buses and go down to, these voter registration campaigns and to these city halls and to these courthouses. It was the sound that really disarmed white folk, even when they didn't know that they were being disarmed. But it also, as the movement folks say, it gives you the confidence to move mountains, as we would say in the church. It gives them the confidence to take that belief and maneuver it into a political and an actionable political goal, which, don't take my word for it, listen to how she explains it. And that's what I want to encourage everyone to do today, is to listen to Bernice Johnson Reagan talk about her relationship to sound and movement. It's really, really beautiful, the way that she elaborates it. And so she was in Albany, Georgia, and Albany had experienced, what some people would, like with Macomb, would call a failure, right? In some ways, they were outmaneuvered politically by the sheriff in Albany. And yet, that movement did not die. And there's a reason for that. And so, I want to name her again, Bernice Johnson Reagan, who sacrificed much. Yeah. She, of course, will go on to do many great things, including, working almost alone for a while at the Smithsonian in terms of like supporting and elaborating the importance of, African American or African folk culture, diaspora folk culture. She is the editor of several volumes that looks at this, because you have to put on these really elaborate exhibits. And back then, just as they do now, every exhibit had a catalog. And so during that time, the notion that African American ethnomusicology was a field of study wasn't a thing, right? It was something that people didn't imagine as relevant. And she was there alongside, the people like Roland Freeman, the great photographer who also recently made his transition, the visual culture that goes along with this, right? I mean, these are giants in this notion of cultural work. And, she, of course, also founds the group Sweet Honey in the Rock, where most people would come to know her. And this a cappella group of Black women singers, and their ability to, again, use the idiom, right, that they learned from, rural Black America, and bring it into a space where people can reach out and touch it and bring the political salience at the same time. Their most famous song is a tribute to Ella Baker, a song called Ella's Song. And, it's one thing to sing the freedom songs, and it's another to share them. And that was part of what makes this group, and also the work of the SNCC Freedom Singers, which, of course, Bernice also founds along, and, Chuck Neblett and Betty Mae Fikes. These people still walk the earth as well. But the ability to share it, which means that we aren't just singing it for, to hear ourselves sound good. We're sharing something about ourselves to you, giving you something to feel, to reach out and touch, to give you not just strength, but memory. And that's what I kind of attach to when I hear the music. It's like, oh, this unlocks a memory. This unlocks a thing that I went through, or I've been through, and I might continue to go through if I pay enough attention to what's happening around us. And so, SNCC really believed that music, and Hollis Watkins is another figure that we talked about yesterday, also believed this, but SNCC really believed that the music was critical to the movement, and it wasn't just a side thing that she did to open the meetings. It was part, it was integral, it was connected to everything else. And so I just wanted to say a few words about Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagan, because she would go on to get a PhD at Howard University, one of the earliest PhDs that actually used oral traditions as a source in history. She wrote about the songs, of course. What else would she write about? But she wrote about the songs as a source, as a way of thinking about, the movement as a way to interpret how black people felt about the movement, right? Because in 1975, when she wrote her dissertation, most of the histories were top-down histories. The movement was what the politicians said it was, what the quote-unquote leaders said it was, what the people who made the headlines said it was, right? And so the movement gets reduced to a James Meredith, or reduced to an MLK, or reduced to a Malcolm, or reduced to all of the peoples that we reduce it to when we talk about it. But she says, what happens when you think about the ways that the sound emanated from these regular, ordinary people? What were they saying about when they sang these songs? That's a political vision, right? That is the movement in many respects. It moved the crowd, as the hip hop tradition would narrate and elaborate with the definition of an MC, right? Except that back then the MC was somebody who could sing "Go Down Moses," somebody who could sing, you know, this idea of before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. This was what moved the crowd. And yeah, it was a critical organizing tool. And so Greenwood, going back to that a little bit, Greenwood was a site where that had to be put in place as well. And so we talk about how it starts from Sam Block and several others who were, again, native to Mississippi, Lawrence Guyot as well. I wanted to name him. We'll talk about him a little bit more later. Or native to Mississippi, and the elders like Robert West and some of the people who had houses and who thought it not robbery, as we say in the church, to let them stay. You can stay in my house, right? Even though that's a risk, you know? We'll find somewhere for you to lay your head. This was like basic organizing 101. And how do you get people to trust you that your intentions are pure so that they can take care of you in that particular way? Fannie Lou Hamer, I would never forget the way that she puts it, or that the way that Kwame Ture narrates how she puts it. You know, if I ain't got but 2 chicken wings in the pot, that means you can get at least one. It's like, what? 2 chicken wings, that's not a lot of food, but you gonna give it away, give one of them away? Yeah, because I need you to eat. Why do I trust you? And why would I feed you? Like, these are things that organizers, when you get bogged down into theory, tend to forget that there's this basic human connection that you also have to cultivate so you can get fed, right? Kwame Ture would also mention that I never thought about wealth. I never thought about, you know, these material questions, because I knew that if I was loyal to my people would make sure that I had everything that I needed, right? And so it was a struggle to live on a SNCC salary in many respects, but it wasn't, right? Because they knew that if they built family, they would be taken care of. Greenwood was a place where that was tested at a level that ultimately makes the movement in the next 2 years possible. And so, you know, I look forward to hearing, and I'll probably be online participating next week, but, you know, when Dr. Allegra talks about, you know, that, the elaboration of that from the beginning of 1962 through the summer and winter of 1963, these pivotal 2 years. So the other thing that's really important is that, just like we talked about with Bernice, things are going on in other parts of the region. Things are going on in other parts of the country. And so the years 1962 and 1963, you're also seeing, you know, internationally stuff happening, but certainly Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Arkansas, Virginia, SNCC has a presence, right? There are campaigns going on in all of these different places, and also Maryland, Cambridge, Maryland, right? Gloria Richardson. There are things that are happening. And SNCC is developing lessons out of all of these particular struggles, and their ability to cobble together these lessons. And this is why, you know, Jim Forman's book is such a critical book, The Making of Black Revolutionaries. The ability to cobble those lessons together will have implications for their political response in 1964's Freedom Summer. So you have to study SNCC as a whole, not just, state by state, or not just from the perspective of, the field workers and the national office but all of it together, because they're building on those lessons as they're growing as these movements, or as these campaigns are growing, and solidifying and building up to this crescendo such that we can have this big effort in 1964. So Ella Baker calls that spade work. Spade work. SNCC famously was the only organization that actually was devoted to that. The only only the major civil rights organizations that were devoted to that, almost as a matter of philosophy. Spade work was what Walter Rodney would later call grounding. You go into a community and you stay there for as long as it took to build the relationships and the trust that will enable you to actually do the work. And so we've been talking about this a lot, but I want to use Ella Baker's term in this context because for her, spade work was unsexy. Spade work did not attract the media. Spade work did not stroke the ego. It didn't make you feel like you were doing something, right? You don't become a star doing spade work, but it was absolutely necessary. And I think about how we narrate the movement, what Charles Payne calls the master narrative, in ways that deny the significance of spade work, or only centers the visible work that usually isn't the same as the spade work. How might we rethink the narrative if we center spade work? The unsexy stuff that Bob Moses was doing, and the unsexy stuff that Sam Block was doing. At one point, he had to sleep in his car, right? Does that change how the history will be written? And I think that this is really why, Payne's work is on our syllabus. And he spends a lot of time talking about the unnamed forces and the named people that only the people that were there knew, like the McGee family, like the Johnson family in Mississippi, and the Green family, and the Richard Wesses, and all these people. And I mentioned families for a reason, because at a certain level, Payne shows us is that young people start pushing their parents and grandparents, not the other way around. And these whole families get involved, right? So that kind of tells us something about the significance of spade work and how spade work had been understood by not only the SNCC veteran or SNCC workers, but the peoples who are already there. If you're willing to actually spend a lot of time and sit down together and ground with me, then maybe there is something about you that I can trust. But if you're only around when the cameras are around, or if you're only around to, appropriate something and then leave, and then why are you here? This will become an issue in 1964 as well. What does it mean to give up, like Charlie Cobb did, your entire life because he was in college at Howard University? He said, I'll just leave Howard and I'm going to go live in Mississippi for the next 3 years. To do that work and to risk your life while doing that work, but also at the same time to create community and family. And then you turn around one day and there's 1,000 white kids saying that they can bring something to the table. It's like, what can you bring? I've been here for 3 years doing this. And so there's some tension around Freedom Summer, and we'll get into that because SNCC's definition of the work was solidified in that moment where the Greenwood movement grows and provides that base. And then things start to shift under their feet. And how do we deal with that? How do we deal with, one thing that happens, some of the funding gets withdrawn, right? Another thing that happens is some of the concessions that were made in 1962 are no longer made, and white supremacy is readjusting. And one of the readjustments, and this is why John Dittmer, his work, Local People, is important as well. He frames it as the violence comes back, and not in the sense that it ever went anywhere, but in the sense that the Klan reemerges as an organized force once they realized the success of Greenwood. The Klan is not always there, right? It's reorganized as a consequence of what we were doing. And so these things are really important to contextualize as well. So like I said, things are happening all around the country. Another thing that matters to this particular moment, 1962, 1963, by the end of 63, the voter education project, as we talked about yesterday, they're like, we can't mess with all of this. Y'all doing the most, right? And so increasingly they withdraw, which means the perception is that the federal government does not support what we're doing, right? That also runs into the anti-communist hysteria of the United States, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the decline of the VEP support is a major factor that leads to Freedom Summer as well. And so as you get to the end of 63, we also know Birmingham is a big thing that's happening nationally. The Children's Crusade, all throughout the summers and fall of 1963, early fall of 1963, culminates in the murder of 6 children in Birmingham in September 63. Only a few weeks before was the March on Washington. SNCC, of course, is involved in that, both on the organizing side and on the speaking side. Famously, John Lewis's speech is stripped of its radical potential at the end of at the last minute. There's a story. If y'all want to talk about that story, we can talk about it. But there are these many different factors. Then at the end of the year, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But local to Mississippi, they participate or they craft something called the Freedom Vote. Y'all familiar with the Freedom Vote? So the Freedom Vote basically was this mechanism where I think it was embedded in somewhere in either the Democratic Party's rules that you could launch a protest election or a mock election. And so COFO decides to actually do this mock election to demonstrate to the Democratic Party or to protest the Democratic Party's policies around voter reg. And this was a tactic that actually was first done in Selma, of all places. They take that initiative. Actually, let me backtrack. I think Selma pioneers the Freedom Day. We'll talk about Freedom Days in a second. But the Freedom Vote, there's so many words with freedom in it. I'm sorry, the concept of freedom in it. Anyway, so Freedom Vote, Freedom Day, Freedom Vote. The Freedom Vote was Aaron Henry. So they ran Aaron Henry for governor and Ed King, who's a white clergyman, I believe, for lieutenant governor, to show the state that here's what we could do. The reason that that's important is that in order to campaign for a mock election, you needed to canvass. SNCC didn't have the manpower. So Allard Lowenstein, who's a white liberal, used his contacts at Yale and Stanford to get some students there into the state. And so that was the show or that was the demonstration that maybe white volunteers could work. Because when they came, attention came, the media came, and that's when the debate really starts between regular SNCC staffers, among regular SNCC staffers and COFO, around what can be done to, or what might we do with white volunteers. And that's something that we'll talk more about. But so the Freedom Vote was a big part of that. Freedom Day was a more concerted effort to raise the issue of voter disenfranchisement by doing a massive protest at city halls. And so instead of just going with 10 or 15 people to go register, right, you have 100, 150, 200 people try to register at the same time. And as they're trying to register, you have another 100 people picketing. And so that's a different story when it comes to trying to repress. Like, in order to repress 300 people or to try to stunt that particular movement, you have to call in like the cavalry, which is what they do in Bloody Summer 65, of course, right? And so Freedom Days were actually successful because white folks were outmaneuvered, right? Especially in a place like Selma or Hattiesburg. And it's the one at Hattiesburg that gives the momentum to what eventually becomes Freedom Summer. So I just want to give those contextual things before we talk about the debate and what the main lines of the debate were. So let's stop here. Are there any questions? I know you got to go to the other. So thanks for coming, though. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, one question I was thinking about the other week is,
Yeah.
my question was that I've been thinking about over the week is like with this mock election, if in an Africana lens, would it be appropriate to place it in a genealogy or something like election day, or what we call Negro election day? That I'm sure that comes up about in the 18th century in the New England area, but where black people are festivals, bring West African stuff involved in their election.
I think that's a solid question. I think this was something, as you know, of course, Miguel, but this was something that was done also in the Caribbean. To me, it's not necessarily the same. Here's why. Underneath that kind of 18th and 19th century example, there was never any attempt to mainstream that into a political regime, right? It was almost a way for black people to demonstrate to themselves who they were. Whereas the Freedom Vote may include a little bit of that, but mostly it was, how do we take power away from the mainstream political regime? But I'm really thinking on my feet here, so let me just work through it a little bit. But that's my initial impression. They never thought that, the titular head of the Negro King was really someone that had actual state power, in other words. Right? There might have been symbolic power. There might have been even something internal to black people's sense of order that they felt was connected to this. But they never thought that these people they never organized a rebellion out of that, right? It wasn't the attempt to use that in a way that a sense of a Queen Anne used their symbolic power, or a Boukman used his symbolic power, or even a Saint Malo, or even you know, a Gabriel Prosser. These people who also had the same stature in the black communities, but also translated that into struggle in a way that the election day festivals did not. So just for people who may not be familiar with the question, with what we're talking about with this question, in parts of the Northeast, as well as in parts of the Caribbean. Yeah. Okay. So the question was, to what extent could the freedom vote elections be compared to election day festivals in the Northeast during enslavement, or Pinkster, because that was another tradition in New York City, in New York. So in Cuba, I think it was the governor's ball. So all around the Caribbean, they have these. So the example is a good one, but for those particular festivals, it was more about enslaved people using these opportunities to build community and build connections. And the enslavers felt that the peoples who were elected on those particular occasions to represent or be the king, if you will, of the enslaved communities was a way for them to keep control and power. But we know that it was not that simple to the enslaved people themselves. They saw it as more of a symbolic representation of their communities, their self-contained notion of who was part of our community. And underneath all of that, of course, many other things are going on. Sterling Stuckey writes about some of the things that are happening in terms of, like, you know, language being spoken at these festivals, or religious traditions being shared, right? And so for me, none of that is really happening with the mock elections. What is really happening is they're showing the state of Mississippi, the Democratic Party, that this is what might happen, or this is what should happen when it comes to actual representation in your party, or in this particular county, or in this particular region. So yeah. But again, I think, you know, we can draw some parallels. Absolutely, you can draw some parallels. I would say that more connected to that example would probably be the churches, what the churches were doing in terms of some of the leaders in the church, in terms of symbolic representation. And, you know, because we know that even the leaders in the church aren't necessarily the leader, right? It's a symbolic relationship. It's a understanding of you being, as we like to say, the vessel, but not the thing. And I think that's probably closer to the election days that were happening in the enslaved community, particularly with the Pinksters. Like, you know, this was like a spiritual representative almost to them. It wasn't like, you know, state power, or we're actually taking over New York. Like, no. But it's interesting that, again, I'm continuing to think on my feet. I got you. And the way that Delaney writes about the governor's ball in Blake as potentially being that, if you could harness it, if you could harness this idea that we get a couple of days off to have this festival, and we're all, like, you know, in the streets. Also in New Orleans, it's, you know, Mardi Gras, like same, right? If you could harness that, then maybe it could be closer to, like, you know, doing something like taking state power, or creating forms of, you know, freedom, autonomous, you know, departures from enslavement, right? And so one of the things that I lament, but also I think is interesting from the space of imagination, is we don't know how Delaney's book ends, because the ending of that book is lost. Yet so much happens as a consequence of them coming together during the festival period in Cuba. Like, it allows them the space to actually know who's who and organize. So I think that I think Stuckey's taking a page from that. Sterling Stuckey is taking a page from that in slave culture when he talks about election day festivals in the Northeast. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely connected to it because I can imagine, and we probably have evidence of it, that would pass the test of the historian too, that there are people who are like making those kinds of plans using the festival period as a way to make those kinds of plans. Even if it's just like taking a day off in order to make going back a little bit easier, right? Or like using something like rest as a means for, making a plan with somebody else on another plantation that you would then, I'm sure, I don't even have to speculate. I'm sure people were making plans during those times. In fact, if you take Frederick Douglass's word for it, right? He saw it as a time for people to get drunk. And his reading of it was, they're plying us with liquor so that we can get off our game. That's how he reads it. Like, they're trying to ruin us. And I'm like, yeah, but they know something must be afoot. They know something must be afoot. And so the notion of the Christmas holiday being a place or a time where a revolution was planned is actually demonstrated over and over and over and over. Where they're talking about 1831 in Jamaica, Sam Sharp's rebellion, right? Really the Baptist rebellion. They had 30,000 people involved in that rebellion. That's unfathomable for many of us. December 27th, 1831. But also 1795, North Carolina, right? They're using those days off to then think about. And so to me, that's absolutely petit marronage. It's one of the great examples of petit marronage that can then translate into open rebellion. So, yeah. Sure. Okay. That's a beautiful question. So, the repression was severe, as we talked about yesterday. People spent over a month in jail. And when they were bailed out, they went in different they went different ways. And so the kids, some of them, they end up having to go to, oh my God, the name of the college. It's a small college in Mississippi. Smaller than Tougaloo. It'll come to me later. But one of the smaller colleges opens the doors to the kids, to the students. Hollis Watkins and Curtis Hayes actually go to Hattiesburg but to organize, to continue to organize. And everyone else retreated back to the Delta, I think. But certainly there was a lot of movement across the different parts of the state. But by the time the beginning of the year, so the beginning of 1962, there's a decision made to go into the Delta. And that's where not all of it, but certainly a great deal of the energy comes, and actually reinforcements came, right? And that's where that work really pops off. And so in Macomb, of course, they're still working. right? The students, the staff can maneuver like that, but the people who are like who live there, they're still working. They're still trying to figure out what to do. And I'm glad, Kia, I'm glad you asked about, well, how does that change, or what does that mean for 1964? Because one of those elders that actually continued to, stand 10 toes down and continue to do the work, he's harassed for 2 years. And the reason that he's harassed is he was a witness to the killing of Herbert Lee. Herbert Lee's murder. Alan, what's up? Herbert Lee's murder was, again, I just can't. Oh my God. I'm expecting to get emotional about it. I can't overemphasize how critical this moment was, because E.H. Hurst, again, like I said yesterday, that was his childhood friend. But by the time they become adults, E.H. Hurst is a state legislator. So it recalls for me Reconstruction in some of the worst ways. You're a state legislator and you kill somebody with witnesses and got away with it? And so Allen, who was murdered, Lewis Allen, who was murdered at the top of 1964, after being harassed for 2 years, he was 1 day away from actually leaving and going to Milwaukee. They caught him on the day he was about to leave. That murder, that assassination, is what actually ends the debate in SNCC about whether or not to do Freedom Summer. So going back to what we were talking about, sacrifice and like what it means for us to actually give your lives for something. Nobody wanted Lewis Allen to be killed. And he should not have been killed, clearly. But his assassination and the reason he was assassinated, and no consequences, just like Herbert Lee's assassin, no consequences. It ended the debate. It's like, why are we debating this? Let's just go do it and see what the end gonna be. We owe something to this person, this elder. And what's also critical is that some of the Macomb elders and the Greenwood elders, they looked at the SNCC staffers arguing. It's like, y'all arguing, but this is like real life, and let's just get on and do it, and let's see. And so I think that the role that that Macomb plays is absolutely critical to like what unfolds in 1964. And we know that in terms of the nuts and bolts of organizing in Macomb in 1964, which in the full syllabus, there's a whole week devoted to that, was a major pillar of Freedom Summer itself. Yes. Okay. So the key players in Greenwood, there are many. So on the SNCC side, I mean, you have obviously, Bob Moses, but certainly Sam Block, who's the first to go into Greenwood as an organizer. But Sam Block is native Mississippian. And so it's, again, that relationship between these young people who are incited by the presence of SNCC, but also they can maneuver differently because they are native Mississippians too. Next to LaFleur County is Sunflower County, and Fannie Lou Hamer. I mean, how can we not mention her in relationship to this? Fannie Lou Hamer was also a major player in Greenwood, but she was in neighboring Sunflower County in a small place called Ruleville, Mississippi. I mentioned three families, and these are the three families that Charles Payne mentions. That's why I'm mentioning them. But certainly, learning about these families from people who were involved in the movement exemplifies again the role of just ordinary people in these in this movement activity. And so the McGee family, which was matriarchal, the elder, for some reason I want to say Laura, but I'm not confident. Laura McGee, who was one of those black women that would defend her space. She was not nonviolent, right? She had, I think, 3 sons. 2 of the sons almost single-handedly, led nonviolent direct action struggles in the movie theater in town at the same time that the voter registration stuff was happening. And so, again, that split between the two is more apparent than real. And that family was really critical. Also, the Johnson family. June Johnson, who was, I think, 14 years old, goes to a mass meeting, and she brings that energy back home. Her mom was like, I don't know about that. In fact, her mom was kind of strict. Like, don't deal with them. So her grandma, her mom's mom, is the one that, like, normalizes it for the family. And eventually her mother also joins the movement, right? The Green family, who is really critical as well. Dewey Green, he was middle class. The children were brilliant, and they also joined alongside the family. Dewey Green was famously one of those black folk in Mississippi. It's like you don't take shit from white people ever, and he instills that into the children of that family. They get involved very heavily in the movement as well. So those are just some of the names that are really critical in developing the movement in Greenwood. I think about Charlie Cobb a lot as well. Ivan Hodonelson from the SNCC side. These are people who left school, right? Came to Greenwood and seemingly never left. Came to that area and seemingly never left. So yeah, there was that. So usually when King would come to town, it was good, right? Because they could get more people to come out. And the struggle was, how do you get people to stay after they come out? So if King is speaking at a mass meeting, you can expect there to be a crowd. And now SNCC's job is, well, let's organize this crowd, because King ain't staying. King gonna be gone in 2 days. So what we gonna do with the momentum of all these people coming out? Because again, to simply come to a mass meeting is to put a target on your back. So if you're gonna come for a reason, and that was how, like, the organizing would go forth from that particular point. And so they saw King as a strategic ally, even as they critiqued some elements of his program. Yeah. King, of course, also supports initially the Freedom Democratic Party that comes later in 1964. So we get into that later. Yep.
Was there any evidence of white folks or FBI informants that infiltrated SNCC to subvert their efforts as was implemented in the Nation of Islam or other black or African organizations in this country?
All right. Evidence. Evidence that passes the litmus test of the discipline of history or black people evidence. I think we have evidence of both, actually. So if you actually look into the notion of infiltration and all of the different mechanisms that the FBI used, certainly, but it was not. It was kind of like with the ways that my elder A. Peter Bailey talks about the FBI and Malcolm X. They knew when things were about to happen and did not step in to protect. And so that's the kind of way that they dealt with it. Because again, their mandate, going back to the voter education project, the Kennedys' promise to the volunteers, the Kennedys' promise to SNCC, right? Oh, we'll protect you. And then there's no protection when things happen, or there's no prosecution when things happen. And so there's that. But in terms of subversion, in terms of people who might have been agent provocateurs, in terms of people who may have been informants, all of those different things, of course there were. And we know that that's true because of the ways in which the government, and James Forman is great on this, so read his book, because the ways that white liberals and the so-called left actually undermine what they were doing. And so I mentioned earlier that anti-communist hysteria is part of the story as well. Allard Lowenstein, who actually invites the Yale and Stanford students during the Freedom Vote in November 1963, is a Cold War liberal. He's a Cold War liberal. And so in some ways, the white liberalization of the movement was in many ways an attack against the elements of the movement that were actually connected to socialist and communist struggles. So Highlander Folk School, right? They always tried to disassociate the movement with them, but you couldn't. You couldn't take Septima Clark away from, or you know, the people like Miles Horton. You couldn't take them because they were really critical to that formation. And so part of the infiltration was you got to disassociate from those communists, right? That was a big feature of Freedom Summer because in the wake of the government's failure to protect the rights of the staff and the volunteers, who does SNCC turn to? The Lawyers Guild, which to this day is probably the only one of the few legal organizations that the left can actually trust. But during that particular period, the Lawyers Guild was branded as a communist front. So was the Southern Educational Fund, if I'm getting that right. I mentioned Ann Braden yesterday. Ann Braden was also branded, just like Miles Horton, right? Miles Horton and them as a communist. And so these white communists and also people who were supportive of them in the black freedom struggle, like Jack Odell, right? And many others, they were forced to make a declarative, or to create a declarative distance between those individuals in order to remain appealing to the liberals who had access to funds to support the movement. And so again, James Forman is really critical in this because James Forman ran the national office. So he was the one that would get the calls. Why y'all working with the Lawyers Guild? Why y'all working with Ann Braden? Are y'all communists? Yada, 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 yada. And so for them, it wasn't an ideological question at all. For them, it was These are people who are making sacrifices alongside us, and so they're good with us. That was it. And so that was not a ideological issue, but for the state, it was, now we got to be suspicious of you. Are you subversive? Blah 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 blah. And so then surveillance happened more and 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 more. But certainly after 64, right, when they started talking about Black Power, and when they started talking about moving on cities, absolutely there was infiltration and surveillance at a high level. At a high level. So, yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Let's do it. Okay.
So Bob Moses said the Mississippi Summer Project was an attempt to answer key questions, namely how to make more people in the country understand what blacks were facing under racist tyranny and how to make people exercise political power. Can you speak to how the project answered and didn't answer those questions?
Wow. Let's read the questions one more time.
Bob Moses said the Mississippi Summer Project was an attempt to answer key questions, namely how to make people in the country understand what blacks were facing during racist tyranny and to make people exercise political power. Can you speak to how the project answered and didn't answer those questions?
It's certainly, so they were right. So we're going to lay down some of the main lines of the debate within SNCC in a second. But certainly they were right to think that it would bring attention to what Black people are actually facing. And one of the reasons I asked you to repeat those questions is because Bob's questions sound just like James Forman's questions. So I'm going to read James Forman's questions after I answer this. But they were right. And again, with the murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, we get a sense of what happens when white folks die, right? Same thing happens again in Alabama, right? The murders of Jonathan Daniels and the murders of Viola Louisa and James Reeb and others, right? So when white folks died, they make the ultimate sacrifice too, which is to say that them giving their lives might pierce the consciousness of other white people, of the government, and it might show you what Black people were facing every single day, the threat that Black people in the South, particularly Black people who were organizing in the South, faced every single day. There's a power to that, and there's also a limit. There's also a limit to it. The limit is y'all can go home anytime y'all want. Right? But the local people, they live under that threat. Their lives are determined. Like I said with Lewis Allen, he tried to get out. He couldn't even get out. I tried to get out, and I couldn't get out. And so, as an organizer, then, if people are going to actually temporarily, in some white state, let's give credit where credit's due, right? But if they're going to temporarily give their lives to this particular cause or be subject to the potential, then we have to actually use that to the limit that it's worth. And that's kind of where the debate goes. It's like, if they really want to face this, let's use that. Let's absolutely use that. Let's not discourage that. Recognizing the contradictions. Let's not be naive at the same time. And so to the second question, whether or not they actually address this political question of political power, I think it's absolutely the case. And it also, again, showed the limits of political power at the same time. It was absolutely an education in both what it means to create people power and also what it means to have people power be betrayed at the same time by what democracy actually is in this country. And so it's like, yeah, let's actually create a democracy rather than assume that one already exists. That is what they learned. And that, Dr. Felicia Denard is going to talk about this in the last week. In fact, the last session, learning through the failure of the Democratic Party, Freedom Democratic Party, to be sat at Atlantic City is actually what opens up the struggle to the direction of Black power in 65 and 66. It wasn't disillusionment. It was, yeah, we're disillusioned with the Democrats. But so let's build real democracy, right? Let's build radical democracy. And in fact, one of the, so in our Lowndes County syllabus, which I'm really excited about, we do a whole week unpacking whether or not radical democracy is a contradiction in terms. So we get really in our theory bag that week. Because that's really what they're trying to grapple with, right? We the people, one man, one vote. All of these rallying cries coming from places as far-flung as Southern Africa and reaching into Georgia and reaching into Alabama. All right, let's actually imagine that we are constitutional people. Is that radical? Why or why not? But what is very clear is that it was too radical for the Democratic Party. And that is where new options had to be forged. And one of those options was radicalizing the Democratic Party. It wasn't the only option, but it's certainly the case that you go to 1972 and you got the National Black Political Convention. They want to infiltrate the Democratic Party with this agenda. They don't want to be on the outside trying to, ram it in. What do they learn, right? What do they learn in the ensuing decade that then propels Jesse Jackson, right? And then what do we learn in those campaigns? One of my problems with the debate and the discussion now is we don't talk about that. We skip from 64 to now and then don't deal with actually what 64 made possible in 74 or in 84. That then helps us understand the contradictions of now. And so there's either this wholesale endorsement of everything electoral politics or a wholesale rejection of it. There's no nuance that recognizes what happened in these last 60 years that makes these options what they are right now. And as organizers, that's the thing that we have to grapple with and really think about and study. Like I really would want to do a course on the Jesse Jackson campaigns. Like I mentioned Jesse Jackson in my classes and students just start laughing. Like, what do you mean Jesse Jackson? Ha 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 ha. I'm like, no. Jackson built a movement. He was the last politician to actually build a movement. Right? In fact, one of the things that made Jackson's campaign so exciting in 84 and 88, he says, I'm not a politician. Right? And so I think that there's actually a connection between that movement and 64. Some of the same people are involved, in fact. And then some of the same people are like, well, we're not going over there, right? And so there's these things, these contradictions and nuances are something to really, really, really grapple with. But there's a huge gap in what we study. I was mentioning with Mark, I think it was on that one, on that show that we did on Night School, Mark Lamont Hill. Nobody studies the National Black Political Assembly. I put it on this syllabus, at least in the description, for a reason, just to have people know that it existed, right? But that was taking really SNCC-oriented methods of organizing and going into the cities. Like Ron Daniels is such a hugely important figure in terms of thinking about this and applying this. But taking these SNCC-oriented principles and going into the cities. Like, we did it in the rural places like Greenwood, but what happens when you go to Dayton, Ohio? Right? What happens when you try to do it in Cleveland or in Pittsburgh or in these particular spaces? And so that's the 70s. That's the lesson of the 70s. One of the lessons of the 70s, right? But we don't talk about that. And I think that here again is why decentering or contextualizing, not decentering, let me not say decentering, but contextualizing the presence of the volunteers in 1964 is so important, because that is where the attention goes. And when the attention goes that way, we act as if that was the only moment where organizing happened. But organizing is happening. It's always happening, but it's happening in nuanced and important ways in the subsequent years, which is why that gap in our knowledge that somehow happens is really important to address. Yeah.
Perfect kind of segue.
Yeah.
So, the first question and then the second question. The first question is from Annette. She asked, what happened to the barbershops in Greenwood? And then Kia has a follow-up question, almost similar to the things you just mentioned
Yeah.
about volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll let you finish with the barbershops and then
I'm not exactly sure what the question around barbershops is. The only reference to a barbershop that I can recall, I think it was either one of the elders, not Steptoe. C.C. Bryant was a barber. C.C. Bryant is in Macomb, not Greenwood. But his barbershop was attacked over and over and over and over again because of his involvement with the movement. I don't know if that question is asking that or that question is asking something different. That's the only reference to a barbershop that I can think of.
Kia said, also, can you please speak to the aspect of state volunteers with an explicit no fear of death? I would like you to expand on the heart of the resolve and the unity or bonds around it for
Yes. So I said I was going to read something, and again, I just want to encourage everybody to get this book, The Making of Black Revolutionaries. Spend a summer and read it, or spending, however much time you got, just read it, because he puts everything in context. But here's what he says at the end of Freedom Summer. So this was part of the reading for today. The last page. It's just a beautiful way that he puts it. Page 385. So the last page of the Forman reading, or second to the last page of the Forman reading. I'm going to start reading at the bottom of the page. And I think this speaks to that resolve, that courage, however you want to put it. And we kind of ended on that yesterday, right? Forman puts it beautifully. He says, we were a band of sisters and brothers, a circle of trust. We were a circle of determined workers who had decided long ago that not to struggle against racism. This was a luxury we did not want, nor could we afford. We were young. We had energy. We had brains. We had technical skills. We had a belief in people and their power to change their lives. We were willing to work with the most dispossessed, the sharecropper, the day laborer, the factory workers, and the mill hands. We were not afraid of death. We knew what we were doing was important not only for the South, but for our sisters and brothers in the North and throughout the world. They needed models to raise their consciousness, to spur them on. And our work did this. Harlem, Watts, Detroit, Newark, the Black Panthers, all can be connected in the spiral of history with the determination of those who faced the Democratic Convention of 1964, culminating the work of 5 years, continuing the spiral of resistance set in motion by our ancestors on the shores of Africa when they resisted slavery. That's the whole class right there. That's the whole class right there. And so he takes what they were, who we are, SNCC, who we worked with, and puts it into a long historical genealogy, both forwards and backwards. We were connected to the people that came, and we were connected to the people that came before us. Why? Because we had energy, we had skills, we believed in each other. Like these like abstract things that become very, very, very consequential. And so yeah, I would that line where he says we were not afraid of death, really powerful connection to that. So it's almost like nothing else needs to be said. But Forman is like, so I mentioned that, you know, Moses and Baker are two strong candidates for like the philosophical foundation of the work, but Forman is up there too. James Forman is up there too. James Forman was like Bob Moses, a little bit older. In fact, he was older than Moses, and Moses was considered older, I should say, because Moses had actually going to college, finished college, going to graduate school. You know, Forman comes out of Chicago, and you know the Chicago iteration of Black freedom struggle is very much a thing. And he has spent time at Roosevelt University in Chicago, which is the famous space where, you know, people like St. Clair Drake worked and others. It was considered a working class university. And when he comes into the movement, you know, he's in his mid-20s. And so he too has this really strong, you know, philosophical foundation. And the reason I love that book so much is he sees revolution in all of it, right? He doesn't root, you know, the civil rights struggle into one of reform or into one of a kind of progressive liberalism. He sees revolution in all of it. And that's important, and that's an important framing, even if we might contest some of it, right? It's an important framing because by thinking the Black freedom struggle as a consistent move, we can better understand the assumptions that the masses made when they participated, right? They weren't naive. They didn't, you know, not know what they were doing. And I think that that's really important because sometimes we think that people have to be guided and led to revolution, right? But that's not what this story or what his framing actually, that's not how he uses it. That's not how he sees it. You certainly think that there should be leadership, but this notion of ignorant masses being pushed by charismatic, you know, figures does not register in the same way in his narration of the Black freedom struggle. So, how we doing over there in the chat? One question, one more. In Alabama? That's one in Alabama, right? Spike Lee's people. I believe so. Piney Woods, I would say Don Stone's book. So Don Stone was a SNCC veteran, was recently transitioned as well. Maybe last 3 years, 5 years now. Wow. Don Stone wrote a brilliant book. Almost like a genealogical study on Piney Woods. So I would definitely reference that book as a way to understand it. But it's one of those Black institutions where education was like, we know that we think education is important, but there's a seriousness that sometimes doesn't attach to that knowledge. Like, yeah, education is important, but no, this is dead serious. It's not something that you play with. And so the elders who constructed Piney Woods came with that energy. And I think it was Spike Lee's grandfather that came through Piney Woods. But it produces so many important figures, just like many other schools of that era, which is why people are at pains often to make desegregation mean the elimination of Black schools, when that's not what the fight was about. So, yeah, I hope that helps. But Donald Stone is the key. So what is this debate about? What is this debate about? So let me read from Forman one more time. So at the beginning of that chapter, inside the Mississippi Summer Project, like I said, Bob Moses' questions sound a lot like like James Forman's questions.
So correction.
Okay. Yeah.
That question that I believe is Kia that asked it,
Uh-huh.
she said correction that actually happened to be Forman.
Okay, cool.
It was to Forman.
No, that's well, it could have been Bob too. So yeah, it's all good. Yeah, it's all good. But on page 371, I just want to put it out there for everybody to hear those questions because, you know, they really are sharp. They really are sharp questions. But Forman writes, in SNCC, we often wondered, how do you make more people in the country share our experiences, understand what it is to look in the face of death because you're black, feel hatred for the federal government that always makes excuses for the brutality of Southern cops and state troopers. We often wondered, how do you make a fat, rich country like the United States understand that it has starving people within its own boundaries, people without land, people working on Senator Eastland's plantation for $3 a day or less. We often wondered, how can you make the people in the United States exercise their responsibility to rid themselves of racist politicians who fight every progressive measure introduced in the halls of Congress? We often wondered, how can we find the strength to continue our work in the face of the poverty of the people, to do everything that that shouts to be done in the absence of so many resources? The Mississippi Summer Project was an attempt to answer those questions. And I think it answered a lot of them. Whether we are willing to listen to the answers is another thing. Right? So, again, Forman's narration of the Summer Project is a really critical one. He sees several issues at work. And so to go through that particular chapter, you'll probably recognize one, of course, is the nature of white involvement, which is a big part of the debate. So the first reading, under the headings, the situation and the dilemma, is actually Bruce Hartford. So Bruce Hartford is out on the West Coast, and he runs the Civil Rights Movement Archive, which is where that pamphlet was actually compiled. And the link takes you to the Civil Rights Movement Archive. My students see that site and it's like, when was this site created? Like in the 90s. But if you get past that, it is the richest in terms of documentation of any site on the internet. And it's curated by veterans. So you can trust everything on it. So I think that is important. That's one of our primary compendiums of resources. So his narration of the situation and dilemma is based on all the documents that he compiled. So the situation and the dilemma, one of the dilemmas was white involvement. And there are two levels of this. The first is those who oppose white involvement argue that how can we build local leadership when we are making space for outsiders to come help with this campaign? Will it slow the momentum or stop the momentum of what we were building in the last 3 years? And for example, if someone comes into a campaign or into an area of the state where you are training, I don't know, a young person in how to canvass, and they are built relationships with the people there, what happens when the next time you open the door, that person is standing next to a white person who's also working with them? And this white person just happens to be a student at Yale. How do you explain that to a sharecropper? Why are they here? And so they're thinking about those nuances of making these. Again, we're talking about community and family at being at the core of all of this, right? And so not only does the canvasser who is already doing the work in a bind because they don't know the person from Yale, not for real. They just met them 2 weeks ago too. So now you're having them accompanying you in this work. What does it mean for the people who you're organizing to have to see this person and also have to build a layer of trust with them too, as well? Then there's the psychological part, right? That staff member might have, I don't know, a 10th grade education. And this college student might have skills that they didn't have access to and resources that they didn't have access to. So what does it mean now that it's their job to actually put in the work that befits their skills instead of training this person with the 10th grade education or the 6th grade, whatever the education was, and how to do it themselves, especially given the fact that it's possible that they might leave after the work is done. And so those are big questions around white involvement. It has really nothing to do with the idea of, well, we don't trust these white kids. It's more, we've been doing this for 3-4 years already, and you're coming as a volunteer. And so that's one side of the debate. Many people, including Charlie Cobb and including Ivanhoe Donaldson and some of the people that had been in the state for several years by then, they're not sure that this is a great idea. The other issue, of course, on that side of the debate is, do we have the capacity to organize this many people? Not the people, but the volunteers, to make sure that they stay on code, to make sure that they are right, are pushing the correct narrative, to make sure that they know what it is to be in Mississippi. That was a major thing because the South has its own mores, right? Even SNCC folk had to learn some of that, right? I got to go to church. What happens when you bring some kids from the Northeast? It's like, I'm not going to church. All right. It's like, wait a minute. You're trying to organize, right? And so these were really, really important considerations. But I think perhaps the most important one, and Forman again talks really clearly about this, is there's this moment when SNCC loses control over who gets in line to come into the project. And that's because Lowenstein apparently felt that everybody had to come through him. He's the Cold War liberal, right? And so they're scared that this is going to blow up in their face. And at a certain point, the alliance with the Northern Student Movement, the Friends of SNCC, and the people that are looking at this as Lowenstein's project comes into conflict. And that really bedevils a lot of the preparation for the summer project. I think Bob Moses even has to go out to Stanford to smooth things over, and that fails. And so as a consequence of all of this, there's this fear that these white volunteers aren't the right people for the job in the first place because of how they came into it. So that's one side of the debate. The other side is Bob Moses standing up and saying, I ain't gonna be part of no racist organization. It's a very interesting thing to say in 1964 because he perceived that the argument was they didn't want white people to be involved. Now, Forman argues later on that Moses wasn't a naive believer in the idea of reverse racism and that he probably would not have used those particular terms later on. But Fannie Lou Hamer says something similar. She says, "We can't be against segregation and then segregate ourselves." To me, that is, again, taking very seriously the idea that there's a place for everybody in this struggle. And sometimes that's hard for some of us to be like, all right, listen to this elder. Because what Fannie Lou Hamer was actually exemplifying was a version of humanity that had never really been operative in any society in the Western Hemisphere. It's like, y'all can come to. Like, what do you mean y'all can come to? But what do you mean? I mean that there are terms. You can't just come and act any kind of way, but y'all can come. Young people did not fully understand and may not have fully agreed, but they listened to her. They listened to her. She was backed up by another elder, M.Z. Moore. M.Z. Moore said, let them come. And so here you have, again, that Black Mississippian orientation, which, of course, is responsible for the whole thing in the first place, right? SNCC doesn't invent the work that they're doing. SNCC is buoyed by this Black Mississippian tradition. And I imagine, and Charlie Cobb would probably be the person to ask, I imagine they're taken aback by the position of the elders. What do you mean just let them come? And then Ella Baker gets up. Right? Ella Baker says, you all have to understand that this is a strategy. And all the things that you were fearful about, we can organize those problems away. And so in some sense, the elders offer, again, that moral imperative of seeing beyond the kind of political surface and recognizing that if these kids want to sacrifice, we have to make space for that. But you just don't come in and act any kind of way at the same time. You got to say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. And you know, things like we call home training, right? Come into my house, you speak, right? Don't be loose out in the street and late at night. All those things that, you know, our elders also say. They said those things to the kids, to the students. And even if you did not agree, which is, of course, Nick famously have knocked down, drag out fights about stuff. And this is one of them, right? George Latner says, the SNCC person will argue with a stop sign. What do you mean I got to stop? And so we're going to argue and we're going to debate, but they listen to these elders. And I think that that's, again, another lesson. Why did the elders believe that there was value in these white kids coming into the project? But again, this is the early part of 1964. And literally as they're having this conversation, the news comes in. Lewis Allen is killed. And the debate just ends. We have to make a major movement, a major splash now. We have to do something now. And so in our flipped classroom format, one of the things that we thought about doing was, you know, staging a debate in the context of the course itself. How many people would have thought they would have agreed with, you know, those who opposed the volunteers coming in? How many people thought they would have agreed with the volunteers coming in? What are your reasons for that? And maybe we can do a little bit of that in the time that we have left. But I'm interested in like thinking about the terms of this debate, largely because one of the things that happens later on in SNCC's history is another debate about the presence of white staff members in the organization, right? And one of the reasons that becomes an issue is because some of the white people who, in fact, come into the state during this particular moment decide that they want to stay and work with SNCC. And so if we're talking about self-determination, if we're talking about the psychological health of Black communities, if we're talking about questions of identity, what role does SNCC play in creating safe space for Black people to work out those issues? I think that's a major question. It's a major question. And it's not a coincidence that those questions would be pursued in the ensuing years by some of SNCC's most outspoken people. Right? Whether we're talking about Willie Ricks or Kwame Ture or many others, Gwen Simmons, right? Zahara Simmons. It's not a mistake that those contradictions lead to that questioning, to those particular positions of the next few years. And the Summer Project is a place where those things begin to spawn and originate. And so it's important to locate some of that there. So a few things before we kind of open up. Let's see. In fact, Forman mentions that, page 372. So a few things from John Dittmer's work. So Local People, again, another one of those essential books, actually comes out around the same time as I've Got the Light of Freedom. One of the things that his book adds that's interesting to this is that as college students from around the country are coming in, there's activity in terms of college students that are already in the state of Mississippi. So Mississippi has at least three state-funded HBCUs: Jackson State, Mississippi Valley State, and Alcorn State. And then you have the private institutions, Tougaloo being most important. Tougaloo was the most open in terms of allowing students to participate or having a hands-off policy with students participated. But certainly the president was a white president, was actually supportive of some of the movement activities at the time. So we have a section of the syllabus that's on Jackson. So Jackson is the capital city of the state. Jackson is where Medgar Evers was, and it's where Tougaloo is in Jackson State and all the city folk. So the reason that Dittmer mentions this is that Tougaloo kind of gets in trouble when it becomes clear that the Summer Project is about to happen, because they thought or feared, white establishment feared, that if Tougaloo remained an active bastion of college students, that it would then be matched with the energy of the volunteers and create a combustible situation in the entire state. And so Dittmer talks about the repression that was that targeted Tougaloo. By the way, many staff people were students at Tougaloo, including Joyce and Dory Ladner. And so if you look at Jelani Favors' book, Shelter in the Time of the Storm, he has a chapter on Jackson State as well, because Joyce and Dory went to Jackson State and then got kicked out, so they ended up at Tougaloo. But Jackson is in this really horrible position of having to receive state funding and thus can't be too open about anything, and that leads to some repression as well. And so Tougaloo students then use that condition or use that space to offer support to many of the things that were happening in the state, including a movement to boycott any entertainment venue that did not play in front of a mixed audience, or did not allow entertainers to play in front of a mixed audience. That boycott got so successful that artists actually supported it. So they wouldn't come to any Jackson venue unless the audience was integrated. All of that is important because the foundations got wind of it. And so going back to Forman's point is that the liberals, particularly Cold War liberals, they could not countenance, right, these black institutions and these black organizations embracing folks who are adjacent to socialist or communist organizing. And Tougaloo gets involved in that. And that's kind of where that repression began, which of course meant that it's kind of taken off the table during Freedom Summer. Not totally, but it's kind of taken off the table. One can imagine the implications of that when it came to like thinking about what might have happened had there been an army of HBCU students alongside the volunteers as well, to meet them, to greet them, and to say, here's what you should do from our perspective, right? So not that that didn't happen anyway, but it was not officially sanctioned in the way that the president at the time might have helped smooth the way in many respects for that to happen. He also mentions the question of federal protection. So his book, that chapter in his book that we assigned actually looks at the contradictions of federal protection, particularly when we consider the fact that the Klan was revived at the very moment that the Summer Project was being debated. If the Klan is being revived, then the question of federal protection is even more important. But we know that there was a debate in the federal government. This is Johnson now, right? Southerner. Complicated friend, if you can even use that word, friend. But he is not sure that he should offer protection, right? And so when we get to Felicia's section of this course, we are going to study the consequences of that decision. Because as soon as it was clear that help wasn't coming, the white violence takes on another dimension. This is where all the cross burnings start. People are disappeared. And we know, of course, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. And if you study that at all, you know that when they were searching for the bodies of those three volunteers, that they found black bodies all over the place that had been heard from in years. People who were disappeared. In other words, they found bodies that weren't the bodies that they were looking for. And then the church burnings. SNCC had an ongoing report of churches being burned. It's like every day of the summer, every other day, another church got burned. Again, recognizing that the only thing that you can attack, if you can't attack somebody physically, is the spaces where they can meet, the spaces that they can plan. So that's the consequence. And I think Dittmer does a beautiful job of understanding the stakes around the federal government taking a lackadaisical approach to protecting these volunteers during the summer project. Wow, it's 7:40. So yeah, what y'all want to do in the last 5 minutes? I mean, I obviously can feel the time, but I want to make sure y'all have some more space to speak back. Yes, there's a mic somewhere. Yeah. And thank you all for coming once again.
localize our liberation
Mm-hmm.
There won't be a two-state solution. So, right, we have to think about how everyone is included in this new form of being.
Yes.
And something that we spoke about yesterday as far as anticipation and class collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what would you say is a model that you would present in order to give a better value proposition than white capital? And white capital, in my mind, being the social capital, political capital,
Absolutely.
and to a lesser
I
extent,
think I hear where you're coming from.
yeah. So, like, what's the model there to say this is actually a better value proposition
Yeah.
relative to the white capital?
Yeah. So 2 things. Even though this is not a 5-minute question, but it's all good. Like I love that. I love that because we're not bounded by time. You're not bounded by time, so I can start this answer and answer it 3 weeks from now. So 2 things. The first is when we study Greenwood. So next week, like really make some space to think about Greenwood. I think Payne is on the next. His narration of Greenwood is on the next day of our class. They are dealing with what I would call anti-capitalist modes of production as a method of organizing. So the government is like handing out food because for whatever reason, the production, as we all know, when capitalism fails, the government has to step in. This is the 20th century Keynesian economics, which is basically socialism. They don't call it socialism. They call it priming the pump of capitalism. and there's an argument. I don't want to get into the economics, but there's an argument for that, right? Because the whole point of Keynesian economics is to save capitalism, right? They use socialism to save capitalism. But SNCC devises a method of what to do with these resources that are being distributed by the state. And I think there's a lot to learn from the ways that they did it because there were lessons learned and failures, right? But essentially, they tried to create an equitable system of ensuring that everybody in Greenwood got what they needed to survive that winter. It was the winter of 62, 63, right? And so that's something to learn from because if we all are acquiring resources through our own, this is what the whole thing about mutual aid was about, right? If we're getting it how we get it, however we get it, the point is not to hoard it. The point is to collaborate with others who are interested in redistributing it to people that actually need it. That's where we are in terms of like movement work now because we don't have a socialist state. We don't have like the infrastructure to actually acquire the means of production. We only have what we have in our houses and what we can acquire. But having it is not a politic. Figuring out how to share it is the politic. And that's where I think so much of the cooperative economics tradition is such an important part of our struggle. And this is here in the People's Forum is a place where people think about this all the damn time. It's like, what can we do now? Right? Panthers call it survival programs. Like, what can we do now? And I think that taking what we have, if you have something, like even if it's, immaterial, like knowledge, right? But if you have something, the point is to share it. The point is to share it. And we have to create structures for sharing. And I think that this is where Du Bois was too in the 1930s when he talks about cooperative economics. The second part of it, of course, is connected to it, and that is we have to create a way to use whatever access to power that we have to build that structure. And the failures of SNCC in the 70s, not the failures, that's not the right word, but the promise of the 70s was, how do you bring the SNCC method of organizing to the actual structure? This is why they go into the cities and say, Marion Barry, you got to run for mayor now. This is why they do that. Word is Julian Bond, you got to be. And so there's a lot to learn from that. And I've been talking about this with my students this summer. It's like we have not studied enough what happens when we acquire state power. Because we celebrate it or we either condemn it. And it's not either or. It's not either or. Like, we get into a celebratory mode. It's like, yeah, we got a black president. Or we get, the black president ain't shit. All right. Perhaps both of those things are both true and untrue. But let's figure out what state power is first, and then we can figure out how to then think about it. And I think that there's so many more lessons. You know, the African America started thinking about this way too late. Like, we had examples of black people with state power way before 2008. Right? Way before 1968, if we're being frank, right? And so there's a gap in terms of our practice of it and our understanding of it that I think we have to deal with, because so many of the movement people in South Africa is a brilliant example, heartbreaking example too, right? When a movement takes state power, because that's the key. And it's not that I'm endorsing that, neither am I condemning it, right? And so what I'm saying is we got to understand what happens, because it can't just be on our individual selves to share, even as we have to do that. We have to think about what structure allows us to share. And can we create a form of power where we can ensure that that happens? This is Fannie Lou Hamer's life after the quote unquote movement. She deals with cooperative economics, like right after. Let's deal with the land again. And I think that there's something to that too. You know, I'm a little country. I'm not that country, but like, somebody gotta learn how to grow stuff again. At some point. I mean, think about like the fact that so many of our people are divorced from knowledge about the land, and how just that knowledge could be a stopgap, not a solution, but a stopgap to some levels of food insecurity. So I'm that person too. Like, somebody go out there and teach kids how to grow stuff, and then yes.
I actually want to say something that inspired me. It's something that a misconception that I often like hear, and it pisses me off. But I hear this whole thing of, that's white people itch, right? So,
Growing food?
growing food,
Wow.
being in nature, going on walks, engaging with animals, right? Like, those are things that we was doing for centuries. So
Yeah.
just hearing you say that just
Yeah.
brings everything back to center.
I don't think you can even understand the rural-based movement without understanding that too. These people were farmers. So yeah.
I got a more fun question.
Okay.
It was one from yesterday, and I forgot who said it. Somebody in the chat said it, but I forgot to ask you who was wearing a shirt. The World Fire shirt.
Oh yeah.
The person asked, who were the individuals
Oh my
wearing
God.
the shirt?
Woo. So had the Jamaicans, Queen Annie, Captain Cujo. So the Windward and Leeward Maroons of Jamaica, really inspiring, legendary figures on the 18th century. Also had the Haitians, Francois McAdam, precursor to Boukman Duddy in Haiti. And who else is on there? That's 4. Oh, Zumbi. Zumbi from Palmeiras in Brazil. Huh? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Of course, there are more than 5 Maroons, but those were the ones that were on that shirt. Yeah. That's a black designer down in D.C. So, yeah. All right. Thank you all for coming. Next week, we're going to have Dr. Allegra. Thank you. So same time, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 6 o'clock. She's going to bring a completely different energy. So we'll see. I'll be there I'll be here Thursday because I have to be in the city for another interesting event. So yeah, I'll see you all Thursday. Cool. All right. This Thursday. Yeah.
SWB Escape 702.
Oh my God.
Say Jersey. Go home, lady.